Thank you very much. After the tech session, it's a pleasure for me to open this segment of Brussels Forum dedicated to security and geopolitics. I'm honored to welcome Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg here on stage. Welcome to Brussels Forum. Thank you. Thank you for being with us this morning. General Keith Kellogg, you serve as the U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine. During President's first term in office, you also served as the National Security Advisor to the Vice President and as the Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff of the National Security Council. Most importantly, you were born in Dayton, Ohio. And this brings me back to a couple of weeks ago where many of us were actually in Dayton for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And a big part of the conversation we had were obviously on Ukraine and the forthcoming NATO summit. So that was a great way of anchoring this conversation we're going to have with you this morning. So thank you again for joining us today. General, your experience at the intersection of military leadership and high-level diplomacy offers a valuable lens through which to examine the challenges but also the opportunities facing the transatlantic alliance. So my first question to you is really on the current state of the Ukraine situation and negotiations. President Trump has campaigned on ending the war in Ukraine and has launched a series of negotiations over these past months. So my first question to you is, how would you assess the current state of the negotiations today, and what lessons have you learned from these past months of discussions with both Ukrainian and Russian delegations?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here today. I think anytime we all need to step back a bit and look at this, what's happening with Ukraine and Russia in a larger view. And what I mean by that, to me, if you're going to be an effective leader, you better pull on history and know what history has brought to the problems and what's happening in the world. And what I mean by that is, I'm a big believer in doing a good review of history. And too many times senior leaders don't appreciate cataclysmic events until they show up on their doorstep. And I go back to our American Civil War, which was a cataclysmic event. We lost over 750,000 Americans killed. It divided our nation, and for years we had to live with the results of what happened in the American Civil War. And I talked recently to our former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who's a big historian. And he said he recently talked to historians who wrote about the American Civil War. And he said that all the historians said that Abraham Lincoln was really not prepared for the Civil War. I mean, nobody really told him about it, what was going to happen, and the subsequent events once the war started, what was going to be there. And that's the reason I'm saying about being prepared for cataclysmic events, being knowing what's coming. And I think you're seeing here what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. You're looking at an event that people need to step back from and say, what are the long-term implications for that? For European security, for global security, for international security. And I'm not too sure we've picked up an appreciation for that. So you based on my experience and what I'm seeing, and making sure that the messaging out there is very good. One of the things we continue to miss is we miss messaging. What kind of message are we sending? Not only to our friends and allies, but our adversaries as well. And it needs to be a very, very consistent message of strength, of unity, and the importance of the things we are seeing today on the ground in Kyiv and in Ukraine itself. So, and I'm an optimist by nature anyway, and we've been at this for a few months, and President Trump said, well, I'm going to end this in 24 hours once he gets in office. He never said what month it was. He just said 24 hours. So I said, okay. And we went at it right away. I put together a really great little team that works out of the White House and the State Department as well. and I brought most of them here with me this week. And we looked at it, and we really studied it. We said, okay, historically, how do you get to the end game? Where do you want to go to? How do we get to target completion? And by the way, if any of you have any good ideas, I'm open for listening to them and passing them on. Okay, because one of the things we want to do is to listen to people and say, okay, what are the good ideas of the day? How do you think we can get out of this? And how do you think we can stop this war? This war is horrific. When you look at the casualties and when you see what's happening in Kyiv, Gloria's my ops officer. She was brought in, came in with me, and when we went into Kharkiv there, a couple of years ago, we stayed at a really nice hotel, but when you went into the hotel, it was like total blackout, 100% blackout. You opened the drapes, the city was totally dark. I mean, this is a major city in Europe, and it was, and Gloria went down to the gym the next morning. She couldn't even get the lights on ever, right? So nothing going on. So, and the TV sets, when you lose power in TV, your screen shrinks. And so you turn on the TV, and it was like you saw a half screen is all you saw was going on. But it was, and the casualties alone, that's one thing President Trump picks up on. We're looking right now conservatively, when you talk about Russian and Ukrainian soldiers dead, you're looking at over 1.2 million killed and wounded. I mean, those are numbers that's called, I call it industrial strength killing. Remember the Soviets left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 60,000. I mean, a nation, if you can absorb that many casualties, I go back to what happened with, and this is the comment I made to the president at the time, there's a term they use in England called the lost generation from World War I. But the trench warfare and the amount of British soldiers killed, they lost a whole generation of young men at the time, and that's what you don't want to see happen with Ukraine as well. That this generation that you're seeing killed and wounded, and the decimation, it becomes a lost generation. And when I went into Ukraine last time, we make sure we go visit the hospitals too, and go talk to the young men now and women as well that have been fighting and we've lost, and it's always good to get their perspective. And one thing I found is as a military officer, many of you who are in this room have been in the military, you can never forget about a fighting spirit, what it means when you're a soldier, men or women fighting for your country. And I think, we in the United States, and I had a chance to talk to the president, and I said, sir, we haven't had an American president since Abraham Lincoln that's had to do what President Zelensky's done. President Zelensky is fighting a war of national survival on his own soil, and that's what Abraham Lincoln did. And fight for on your own soil, for national survival and national sovereignty. And you have to, when you see that, you have to appreciate the issues that they're facing right now on the ground. And I think sometimes we don't see that. We don't put ourselves in their shoes and seeing what we're seeing, and how to work our way out of it. And we've tried really hard to do that. And we've come up with, in the last few months, we've been to Jeddah, Riyadh, Paris, London, Istanbul again, to do technical meetings. And we came up to what we call term sheets. Term sheets are, this is what the outline, this is what it looks like. We think this is your end state. And we took the Ukrainian term sheet, then we got what's called the Russian term sheet, they call it a memorandum, and we put them together. And we said, okay, how can you meld these two documents together to get to an end state? And we are pretty comfortable right now. We know what that looks like. We know what an end state could look like, should look like, and if we can just get to that point, we think it's winnable. Winnable meaning you can get to a peace agreement, and that's where you really want to get to.
Could you share a little bit more on this end state that you've been mentioning? How does it look like?
Yeah. Well, when we talk about it, the term sheet, we talk about a I call it a comprehensive ceasefire. Comprehensive means air, land, sea, infrastructure. And as their Minister of Defense, Umarov, said when I talked to him about it, he said, General, you've asked me the same question numerous times, and I've given you the same answer numerous times. No shooting means no shooting. I said, okay, I get that, okay. So when Umarov said that to me, he said, okay, I understand what a ceasefire means. And that's what we want to get to is comprehensive ceasefire. We call it ceasefire in place. Ceasefire in place meaning the ground you are physically on, that is the ground that is yours now. You occupy that. And that's okay. Does this mean de jure or de facto? By law or just by the simple fact that you're physically on the ground and as your soldiers are there holding that ground? And then we want to get to that. We want to get to the return of the children, the prisoners that are out there, that made a sustainable ceasefire long term, sustainable not only for the Ukrainians but for Europe as well. And then try to get the Russians back into what I would call the League of Proper Nations. So everybody's kind of working together. That we're all, there's a level of, you kind of balance it out, meaning you can all live with the results of this for the long term. That's where you want to get something that's sustainable long term. You don't want to do this. We don't want to see a war start again in 3 or 4 or 5 years. You just don't want to go there.
Thank you for that. So we're sitting here in Brussels, and obviously we've seen Europeans stepping up in many, many ways. They're not directly at the negotiating table, but they have been scaling up their support for Ukraine. As you know, France and the UK leading the so-called coalition of the willing. To what extent is the United States today ready to, first of all, how do you perceive the role of Europe and what it's been doing over these past months to support Ukraine and step up? And secondly, how do you see U.S. role in supporting this coalition of the willing, and how could it translate concretely?
Yeah, I think what's important is unity of the alliance. Everybody staying together, working together. That's absolutely critical. I think that what you don't want to do is, the term I would use as an American term, you don't want any stray voltage. You want to make sure that everybody's in lockstep going forward. And I think that's critical. And you're seeing, and we primarily work with what we call the E3, the Brits, the French, and the Germans as well. And the fact is, we recently had Prime Minister Starmer come to the United States. We've had President Macron come to the United States. And I think that's important, where the alliance stays really together. And I think that sends a very clear message to everybody. And I think it's important. It's important not only for European, the alliance itself, but I think it sends a clear message to President Putin that the alliance is not breakable. It's an unbreakable alliance. We're going to be around, a week from Tuesday. We're not going to go anywhere. And I think that's a critical message that needs to be sent. And it's just not to Russia, but to the entire globe as well. That it's an alliance that's been together for a long time, and it's going to stay together as well.
So we're just a couple of days away from the NATO summit in The Hague, and Ukraine obviously is going to be an important piece of that. You just said it's important to show unity. It's important to show strength, especially during this meeting, for the reasons you just outlined. From a Trump administration perspective, and from your perspective, what would constitute a successful summit? What do you want to achieve? And then as we look forward beyond the summit, how do you see the future of U.S. involvement in European security affairs?
It's a great question. I think what you want to see is, one of the criticisms the United States had with the alliance, and you probably all picked up on that, was when we talked about the defense contributions. Raising that to 5% of GDP, that's going to be very, very important. You go back to the Wales Declaration, when everybody agreed and all the world leaders signed it was going to be 2.5% of GDP, of which 20% of that was on modernization. And everybody kind of agreed to that. When we first came in 8 years ago, the first Trump administration, there was only like 3 nations that were reaching that GDP level. And I think that's be important to making sure that everybody kind of sends a very clear message that we're going to maintain military strength. And frankly, you know, I mean, everybody in this room, I know that if I said, let me, by a show of hands, how many of you can recite to me Article 5 of the NATO treaty? How much everybody in this room could raise your hand? I'll lay you money. But how many of you can raise your hand and say, I know what Article 3 says? You know, I used Article 3, I call that the funding article, which means that each nation individually and collectively will provide for the individual in common defense of the alliance. And I think once that agreement is made, then everybody needs to step up for that. It sends a very clear message to everybody. And I know with President Trump, that was one of his concerns early on. If you're an alliance, you're all part of the alliance. And everybody pulls together on that. And so success would be coming out of here with a pretty well-defined what the defense contributions are going to be. But the second is, where does everybody want to be with Ukraine? What does this look like for NATO and the membership of NATO and working with Ukraine and working with, you know, bringing Russia back into the state of stable nations? What's that going to look like? What's that going to be? And I'm not sure we're there yet.
Well, what I suggest is that we continue the conversation by broadening the panel and welcoming our other panelists to the stage. Thank you, General, for sharing your thoughts. Stay with us so we can continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.